He asked me how many times.
James Faluzak is a former Erie Catholic Diocese priest, now living in Buffalo. He's taken part in recent protests in Buffalo. And he testified before a state grand jury looking into allegations of sex abuse by priests in the Erie Diocese.
I approached them, and that led to my being subpoenaed to become a witness.
He told the panel he was abused by a priest between the ages of 16 and 19. It happened before he began studying to become a priest himself. He spent 20 years in the active ministry, stepping away because of problems stemming from his abuse. Problems including anxiety and stress, and drinking that led to treatment and a DUI.
Certainly in terms of physical ramifications, drinking is the worst thing I could do. But it numbed me. It helped me forget for a minute.
James still has flashbacks, but he's encouraged at the news that the Erie Diocese plans to release names of priests accused with abuse.
I think that kind of transparency is more in line with the church's mission.
James thinks that when the church makes the announcement, it will have a major impact, with many victims coming forward for the first time.
I think it'll open floodgates. There will be many more allegations. There will be much more conversation. People are going to doubt their faith. People are going to lose their faith.
But Faluzak doesn't want just the release of names. He's hoping the diocese, perhaps with the prodding of the Attorney General's office, will release files of suspected abuse cases.
It would point to whether or not the diocese knew of other behavior that they excused, that they overlooked, that they hid. I think the truth of that needs to come out for my sake and with regard to my perpetrator, but with all of these different cases.
Paul Wagner, Erie News Now. State Attorney General Josh Shapiro said former priest David Paulson is facing 14 criminal charges, including 3 felonies. It's the first arrest since the state began investigating the Catholic Diocese in late 2016. Father Paulson is charged with sexually abusing 2 boys between 2002 and 2010.
They were attacked by the very person that they were taught to respect and admire.
Shapiro said some of the abuse occurred in the rectory of St. Anthony's of Padua in Cambridge Springs. Other abuse at a rectory in Freiburg and a remote cabin in Jefferson County. One of the victims even forced to confess the abuse to Father Paulson, his alleged abuser.
This was the ultimate betrayal and manipulation by Paulson. He used the tools of his priesthood to further this abuse.
Shapiro said the charges against Paulson were recommended by the statewide grand jury that's investigating clergy sex abuse in Erie and 5 other Catholic dioceses all across the state of Pennsylvania. Shapiro said the diocese became aware of the priest's attraction to young boys in 2010, even writing what he called a secret memo confirming the priest's inappropriate conduct, but not providing that information to law enforcement for 8 years.
They knew it, and they knew it for years. They did nothing to stop this abuse. It is unconscionable to me that the church knew Paulson was a threat to children and allowed him to stay in ministry and to be a threat to other children. Unconscionable.
I asked Shapiro if any higher-ups in the diocese are being investigated for failing to take the Paulson case to law enforcement. He would not comment, but he made it a point to say the memo was drafted when the diocese was led by now retired Bishop Donald Troutman.
This abuse and the cover-up occurred largely during Troutman's tenure.
Paul Wagner, Erie News Now.
And sexual offenses.
This week, the clergy sex abuse scandal took center stage when the state attorney general came to Erie, announcing criminal charges against former Catholic priest David Paulson, charging him with abusing 2 boys.
They were attacked by the very person that they were taught to respect and admire.
The arrest, announced a month after Bishop Lawrence Persico took the unprecedented step of releasing the names of 34 priests and 17 lay people credibly accused of sex abuse.
I have shared with District Attorney Brad Falk.
Back in 2002, Donald Troutman was also dealing with the clergy sex scandal. He asked then DA Brad Falk to review files and documents. The DA said because of the statute of limitations, no accused priest could be prosecuted.
We have determined that, based upon the information we have available now, there are no prosecutable cases within the Diocese of Erie.
But in another interview with me that spring, Bishop Troutman took it one step further.
There is no one in ministry in the Diocese of Erie who has a pedophile background.
That's what Troutman said. But Father Paulson, arrested this week, was working as pastor at St. Michael's Church in Freiburg at that time in the spring of 2002. In fact, authorities say some of the sex abuse he's charged with occurred in the church rectory. But in 2002, Bishop Troutman made it clear he did not think it was fair for so much attention to be focused on clergy sex abuse.
This is a problem in our culture. It's with married people. It's in all walks of life. Let's look at the whole truth, not just zeroing in on one part.
Paul Wagner, Erie News Now. Shapiro stepped into the room and spoke with 17 abuse victims joining him on the stage. It was clearly an emotional day for the victims, many who testified about their abuse at the hands of priests. Shapiro said the 884-page report is the most comprehensive ever issued.
There have been other reports about child sex abuse within the Catholic Church, but never on this scale.
Victims say they consider the investigation and the report a win against abuse and church secrecy.
It was a victory, a major victory, to get our voices out there, to have our stories told.
Shapiro outlined many shocking revelations, including a priest he said raped a girl in the Greensburg diocese, then arranged for her to have an abortion. Zeroing in on the Erie Catholic Diocese, he said he had harsh words for retired Bishop Donald Troutman, saying Troutman failed to stop abuse by a former priest, David Paulson, who was arrested earlier this year.
The bishop at the time, Donald Troutman, knew all about this abuse, and Troutman covered it up.
Shapiro also said Troutman reassigned another priest who church leaders knew was abusing children for 15 years. And he said Troutman kept Father William Presley in active ministry after victims told him Presley abused them.
Troutman spoke with Presley, who admitted the abuse. Then, 15 years after the Erie Diocese first learned Presley was a predator, the bishop finally revoked Presley's priestly faculties.
After the news conference, James Faluzak, who said he was abused by former Erie priest Daniel Martin, said Troutman should relinquish his title.
I call upon him to resign his emeritus status as retired Bishop of Erie because of his heinous and callous treatment of victims.
The Attorney General outlined the report detailing abuse by 301 so-called predator priests. He made the announcement surrounded by victims of clergy sex abuse and said they were just a fraction of the victims whose lives were changed forever.
Over 1,000 child victims were identified by our investigation, though the grand jury notes that they believe that number was in the thousands.
Jim Van Sickle says he is a victim. The man he says abused him, former priest David Paulson, is now awaiting trial on charges he abused two other boys. Van Sickle hopes the grand jury report leads to changes in Pennsylvania law.
This is the first step and a few more steps that we have to take. This can't be the end. This is actually the beginning.
Shapiro says the grand jury is recommending 4 changes, including modifying criminal and civil statute of limitation laws, clarifying penalties for failing to report child abuse, and making sure confidentiality agreements don't cover speaking with law enforcement.
Certainly, victims are entitled to justice, and there are many ways in which you can accomplish justice. So certainly those 4 can be looked at.
But the main focus will be changing the statute of limitations. The panel wants a window created for victims to file civil suits for abuse years earlier. And Shapiro said the grand jury wants all caps for filing criminal charges to be removed.
Pennsylvania lawmakers should send a clear message and empower law enforcement agencies to hunt down all future child predators, no matter how long they live.
But don't expect any changes to happen right away.
I do think that the legislature is going to need to step forward, and I do think that the will be there, but I don't think anything's going to happen between now and November. I think it's going to have to happen in the next session.
Attorney General Josh Shapiro knew the report would bring back a lot of painful memories for victims, and it did. Some of the victims on the stage with him in Harrisburg were visibly shaken, trying to support each other. He said the 2-year investigation uncovered at least 1,000 victims, but the actual number might be far higher. Evidence suggests that's the case. Just this week, the Erie Diocese has heard about 8 new allegations of abuse, 6 cases of sexual abuse, 2 cases of physical abuse. The allegations against 5 different persons, including 4 priests already on the diocese list as credibly accused of abuse, plus an allegation against a Catholic school teacher not on the list. All the allegations forwarded to the district attorney in the county where the alleged abuse took place. All of the abuse happening many years ago.
These are very difficult things for people to bring forward. More often than not, they have never told anyone about this. And the grand jury report, our own efforts, all these things come together to empower people to come forward.
While the diocese has been receiving reports of alleged abuse this week since the grand jury report was released, actually, the diocese has been getting calls and emails from victims who say they were abused for several months. The call started in April after Bishop Persico released a list of names of priests and lay people credibly accused of abuse or inappropriate behavior. Monsignor Edward Losey spoke to some of the callers.
Just speaking to them on the phone, you can just hear the relief and the letting go of a burden that they have carried by themselves far too long. And so we encourage them to come forward and let other people help them carry that burden.
In the letter, Pope Francis directly responds to the Pennsylvania grand jury report. He said it reflects the abuse of power and of conscience. He called the pain of the victims heart-wrenching and said their cries to heaven were ignored, kept quiet, and silenced. Speaking of the estimated 1,000 victims, he said the church showed no care for the little ones. Bishop Lawrence Persico said the fact the Pope responded so quickly and so forcefully shows he personally is following the events here in the state and realizes just how much the victims are suffering.
I think it shows that, he's watching this and he realizes the pain and suffering that people are going through.
The Pope's letter says systemic change is needed, but he didn't provide details. Persico says the key change has to be more openness.
We need the transparency. That's so important. We need it more now than ever.
The leader of the Erie Catholic Diocese also says the church needs to carefully choose its leaders, and perhaps some current leaders should be forced to resign.
If someone has covered up and has really not made these things known and have not been helpful to victims, then I think that has to be looked at.
While the bishop closely followed the Pope's remarks about the clergy's sex abuse report, so did the man who led the 2-year-long investigation, Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro.
A memorandum in the church's secret archive about GL.
Shapiro, who released the report last week, praised the Pope for focusing on the survivors. Victims who joined him last week clearly show the impact of clergy abuse. Shapiro hopes the Pope's letter will ensure widespread abuse and cover-ups don't happen again. Paul Wagner, Erie News Now. David Polson was led out of the Jefferson County Courthouse in handcuffs, headed to prison, after a judge sentenced him to 2.5 to 14 years behind bars. He had pleaded guilty to felony counts of corruption of minors and endangering the welfare of children. Attorney General Josh Shapiro was in the courtroom for the sentencing.
Today, finally, justice was served upon David Polson, a priest who preyed on children for his own sexual gratification.
Jim Van Sickle, who says Polson also molested him years ago, said the sentence was welcome but not enough.
For a survivor, I don't think there's ever enough time. Just because our own abuse is it doesn't have a time limit on it.
During the sentencing, the 2 victims in letters said their lives have been changed forever. One victim of Polson says he suffered from depression, anxiety, and PTSD, and even considered suicide. Polson said he knows he caused a lot of pain, saying, quoting, "I'm sorry for my actions I committed. They were both criminal and sins. I'm ashamed for what I did." David, you said you were sorry in court. What do you have to say now? Another clergy sexual abuse survivor who knew Polson was not impressed with the apology.
I regard his sentiments as being less than sincere. I've known this man. I know how slippery he is, and I don't regard his comments as genuine.
Polson was one of just 2 priests prosecuted by the state grand jury that named 300 so-called predator priests and 1,000 victims. Investigators looked at clergy sex abuse in Erie and 5 other dioceses. Polson is now the second priest sentenced to prison. Attorney General Shapiro said that while Polson clearly is responsible for his own actions, the Erie Catholic Church is also responsible for letting Polson remain in active ministry far longer than he should have been.
For more than 7 years, the diocese allowed Polson to remain a priest, even though they knew he was a predator. They allowed him to stay there as a threat to others.
Shapiro said while Polson is now headed to prison, his office remains committed to fighting child abuse and helping survivors. In Jefferson County, Paul Wagner, Erie News Now.